People speak of falling in love as though it is a single moment, a glance across a crowded hall, a shared breath beneath candlelight, a collision of two souls that announces itself with thunder and trembling ground. Mine was not like that. Mine was a slow accumulation, a gathering like water in a stone basin, drop by drop, year by year, until one morning I looked down and discovered I had drowned without ever hearing the splash. I was 18 when Omar was assigned to my chambers. He was 19, quiet in a way that was not shyness but rather precision, as though every word he possessed was valuable and he refused to spend them cheaply. The head steward presented him to me in the early morning, when the palace corridors still smelled of last night's candles and cold stone. I remember thinking he had the kind of face that a sculptor would weep over. Not beautiful in the decorative, courtly sense, beautiful in the way that a well-made thing is beautiful, purposeful, complete. He bowed. He said, "Your Highness," and then he went to work. That was all. That was the beginning of everything. In those first months, I barely thought of him as anything other than a function. I was a prince, he was a steward. That was the architecture of our world, and I was not yet old enough or awake enough to question the cruelty of it. He laid out my clothes, he polished my boots until they reflected the ceiling. He prepared my morning water, always the right temperature, always with the particular sprig of dried citrus rind that I had mentioned once in passing that I preferred. He remembered everything I said, even the things I said without knowing I was saying them. It was the remembering that first began to loosen something in me. You must understand what it is to be a prince in a palace like mine. Everyone around you is watching, but no one is truly seeing. The counselors see a political instrument, the generals see a future commander, the court ladies see an eligible prospect that they circle like patient birds. My father, the king, sees an heir, a continuation of his name, his blood, his legacy. When he looks at me, he is looking at a mirror of himself, and when I fail to reflect what he expects, I see the particular coldness that comes into his eyes. No one looked at me or saw me, but Omar did. I could not explain how I knew this in the beginning. It was not overt. He was never improper. He never overstepped the invisible wall of decorum that separates the royal from the serving. But there were small things. When I came back from a particularly brutal session with my sword instructor, the kind that left my shoulders aching and my pride bruised lower than my knees, he would have a compress prepared and set on the edge of my dressing table without my asking, not offered, not presented with ceremony, simply placed there, in the way you leave something for someone you know well, in the way you tend to a person because you have been watching them closely enough to anticipate their needs. When I was 19, I had a terrible week. One of those weeks that exist in the life of a young heir as a kind of extended humiliation, a string of public failures, mispronounced words during a diplomatic reading, a stumble during a formal presentation that the courtiers did not laugh at openly but whispered about for days afterward. My father did not comfort me. My father corrected me. That was his form of love, and I do not say that with bitterness, only with the clarity of a man who has had years to understand it. He corrected me because he believed correction was care. He had simply never learned the other kind. On the last night of that week, I sat at the edge of my bed in the half-dark, and I did not move for a very long time. I did not cry. I had already cried in the only place I allowed it, pressed against the cold stone of the washroom wall, and now there was nothing left but a strange emptiness, the kind that sits in your chest like a held breath. Omar came to turn down the bed. He saw me sitting there. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer platitudes. He did not pretend he had not noticed. He simply set down what he was carrying, walked to the window, and began, very quietly, to describe what he could see outside. The guards making their rounds, a cat sitting on the garden wall, the way the moon was sitting low and orange over the eastern tower as though it were tired. He talked for perhaps 10 minutes, about nothing. about everything small and inconsequential and gentle, and by the end of it, the held breath had released, and I could move again. He never mentioned it afterward. He did not treat me with special softness the next morning. He came in, laid out my clothes, and moved through his work with that same quiet precision. But something had shifted. I knew from that night forward that I was safe with him, that he would not use my weakness against me, that whatever happened in the space of my chambers, in the particular privacy that exists between a prince and his steward, would remain there, held carefully, treated with the same reverence he gave my formal robes. Over the years, the intimacy of his work grew louder to me. I mean the physical intimacy, not the kind you are thinking, the other kind, the one that no one speaks about because it lives in the ordinary, in the careful daily transactions of care that exist between a person who serves and a person who is served. When he dressed me in the mornings, his hands moved with perfect efficiency. He would lift the collar of my undershirt and smooth it flat against my shoulders, then lay the outer robe across my back with an almost mathematical precision, the sleeves adjusted, the sash aligned, each button considered. His fingers would occasionally brush the back of my neck as he checked the fall of embroidery. He never lingered, he was never careless, but I felt every single point of contact. I started to wait for them. Mornings that had once been routine became something I moved toward. I would stand at the window while he worked, and I would feel each adjustment, each small correction, each moment of his hands on my clothes, and by extension on me, and I would catalog them silently, the way a person hoards something they know they are not supposed to want. I was 20 when I understood that what I felt was not admiration.
I was 21 when I admitted to myself, in the absolute privacy of my own mind, with the words as clear as a bell tolling in an empty cathedral, that I loved him. Not in the companionable way a lord might love a trusted aide, not in the fraternal way a prince might regard a loyal servant who has served him well. I loved him the way the poets describe in the old books that I was not supposed to be reading, the ones kept in the lower shelves of the library, the ones about love that was catastrophic and total and ruinous. I loved him in a way that the law called a crime, in a way that the church called an abomination, in a way that, if discovered, would see us both dragged before the court and sentenced to a death that I could not let myself think about in specific terms. So, I said nothing. I stood there every morning in my chambers, and I let his hands straighten my collar, and I said nothing. I sat through dinners with nobles and diplomats and said nothing. I watched him move through the room with that careful, precise grace, and I pressed every word I wanted to say flat, sealed it over, buried it where it could not be found. And I was certain, absolutely certain, that I was the only one who felt it. I was certain he could not possibly know. I was certain that to him I was simply his charge, his responsibility, the prince he had been assigned to, whose well-being was his duty and whose trust was his professional achievement. I was so certain. I was so extraordinarily wrong. I did not know he had fallen too until the winter of my 18th year. There was a night, one of those palace nights that seem constructed specifically to feel lonely, when the corridors echo and the candles burn too high and the wind finds every gap in the stone, when I could not sleep. I had been walking the outer room of my chambers in socks, and I had not heard him come in. He came in the way he always did, without announcing himself, because after 4 years he knew the rhythms of my wakefulness as well as I did. He stopped when he saw me, and I saw in the half-second before he composed himself, before he put on the professional stillness that he wore as habitually as his livery, I saw his face when he thought I was asleep. I had never seen him look at me like that before. Or rather, I had never seen it because I had never caught him in the unguarded moment before the guard went up. It was not a dramatic expression. It was not the face of someone overwhelmed. It was softer and more terrible than that. It was the face of someone in the presence of a thing they love, and the love was quiet and whole and absolutely without hope. It was the face of a man who has made peace with wanting something he cannot have and visits it anyway, because absence would be worse than aching. He recovered immediately. His expression reset. He said in that calm, even voice that he had come to check whether I needed anything. I looked at him for a long moment, and then, and this was the bravest or perhaps the most reckless thing I had done in my life to that point, I said, "Come here." He crossed the room. He stood before me, and I reached out and took his hand. Not in a commanding way, not the way a prince takes anything. I took it the way a person reaches for something in the dark when they are not sure it will still be there.
He went completely still. "How long?" I asked. He did not pretend not to understand. He looked at our joined hands, and then he looked at me, and I saw him decide in real time to stop carrying it alone. "Since the 3rd month," he said. "I tried to stop. I tried many times." "So did I told him. "I am very bad at it." Something changed in his face then, not quite a smile. Omar's smiles were always modest, always slightly held back, as though he was not sure he was permitted them. But something warm and broken and relieved moved through his expression, and he held my hand a little tighter. That was how it began, not with declarations or promises or the language of grand romance. With 2 people in the middle of the night admitting to each other that they had both already surrendered. The months that followed were the closest thing to peace I have ever known. We were careful. We were always careful. What existed between us lived in the space of my chambers alone, that particular sovereignty of a room that belongs to one person, where the usual laws of the palace lost a degree of their hold. He would come in the evenings to prepare the room for the night, and I would not send him away, and we would exist together in the quiet. He would sit beside me sometimes, not often and never if there was any possibility of interruption, but on the nights when the palace was fully settled and the guards were at their outer posts and the world had retreated, he would sit at the edge of the chair near my bed, and I would sit on the bed, and we would talk. He had a mind that delighted me. He had read everything the palace libraries contained and a significant portion of what the trading routes brought in. He had opinions about history that he delivered with this careful, measured certainty, and he would listen to my counter-arguments with genuine engagement, the way no one else in the palace ever quite managed. The court agreed with me reflexively. He challenged me because he respected me enough to disagree. The first time I held him, truly held him, both arms around him, his face against my shoulder, it was not romantic in the way stories make it. It was after a particularly vicious confrontation with my father about the succession. My father had laid out in precise and unemotional terms the timeline of my arranged betrothal, and I had stood there in the throne room and felt the future arrive like a door slamming shut, and I had walked back to my chambers carrying the weight of it and said nothing about any of it, and Omar had taken one look at me and simply opened his arms. I walked into them. I held him, and I felt the world stop trying to collapse for a moment. I pressed my face against the side of his head and breathed and felt his hands come up against my back, steady and real, and I thought with an almost painful clarity that I would give up every title, every inheritance, every golden thing this palace had given me, to be allowed this. Just this. A person whose arms felt like a place I belonged. The small moments were the ones that composed us. Mornings when I woke before him, because some nights he would fall asleep in the chair and I would not have the heart to wake him, and I would lie in the early dark and watch the rise and fall of his breathing and feel a tenderness so vast it frightened me. Moments when he was dressing me and would pause briefly with his hands at the collar of my coat and tilt his face up, and I would lean down, and we would share a kiss so gentle it barely deserved the word, the kind of kiss that is less a physical event and more a statement of fact, a reminder, an acknowledgement. You are here, I am here. This is real. He had a particular habit when he was worried. He would run his thumb along the inside of his wrist, almost absent-mindedly, like a man counting something that cannot be counted. I learned to recognize it. On the mornings after a night when voices had been raised in the hall, or when a particularly severe royal decree had circulated through the palace, I would see that gesture, and I would reach over and still his hand, and he would exhale slowly and press our joined hands flat against the table for a moment before releasing. We did not speak often about the danger. The law was real. The penalty was real. I was the prince, which gave me a degree of protection that I was acutely aware he did not share equally. If we were discovered, the wrath of the court would fall on him with a brutality that did not bear imagining. He knew this better than I did. He had heard things from the other servants, the ones who moved through the palace's lower corridors and heard conversations that were not meant to be heard. I did not know for a very long time the full weight of what he carried. I did not know about the other servants, the ones who had noticed the particular quality of his attention to me, the ones who resented the closeness, the ones who whispered cruel things in the servants' corridors and made his days small and sharp and difficult in ways he never brought to me. He did not bring it to me. He absorbed it and came to my chambers with the same composure, the same quiet warmth, the same careful devotion. And I was so absorbed in my own careful happiness that I did not ask the right questions. I did not know about my father. I learned later, much later, in the wreckage of everything, that my father had suspected before I was ready to admit it to myself. That he had, on 2 separate occasions, summoned Omar privately and without my knowledge. That on both those occasions, my father had made his feelings known not with words, but with the particular authority of a king who does not need to raise his voice because the stakes of disappointing him are already understood. I learned that Omar had been flogged, privately, discreetly, by my father's order, on the grounds of what was called inappropriate proximity to the royal person. That he had returned to my chambers on both those mornings with his composure intact, his work performed with the same gentle precision, his face giving nothing away. That he had come back to me even after that and kept his silence. When I learned this, I could not speak for a long time. I sat with the knowledge of it and felt something change in the architecture of my chest. Some wall or foundation that had been quietly load-bearing gave way, and what replaced it was not grief exactly, but a love so serious and so heavy that it could not be contained in any ordinary word. He had been broken for loving me, and he had kept loving me anyway. He had kept coming back, morning after morning, to dress me with those same careful hands. The discovery, when it came, was quieter than I had expected. I had always imagined it would arrive with the violence of a raid, guards at the door, torchlight, my father's voice like a sentence already passed. I had rehearsed it in my nightmares for years. I had catalogued every possible configuration of exposure and planned in the anxious part of my mind that never fully rested what I would say and what I would do and how I would stand between him and the consequence. What actually happened was a door opening at the wrong moment. My father had come to my chambers himself, unusual, significant, the kind of visit that was never casual. And the outer chamber guard had not sent word ahead, and the door opened onto nothing more dramatic than Omar's hand against my face. Just that. His palm against my jaw, my eyes closed, his thumb against my cheekbone. We had been talking, and something I said had moved him, and he had reached up, and my father had walked in on the small, private, unbearable tenderness of a man touching the face of the person he loves. My father did not speak immediately. I stepped back. Omar stepped back. We both straightened in the specific way that guilty people straighten when they are trying to perform innocence and producing only its outline. My father looked at Omar for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He said, in a voice that I had heard him use in the throne room when passing sentences, "Leave us." Omar bowed. I watched him walk toward the door, and I felt something lunge upward in my chest, some animal panic, and I almost reached out. I almost said his name. But his eyes, as he passed me, were calm. He was telling me, in that silent economy of expression that had become our language, to be still, to let him go, that he could bear it. The door closed. I have sat through many difficult conversations with my father. I have been dressed down for failures of diplomacy, critiqued for weaknesses in my military studies, corrected on matters of state so many times that the shape of correction is familiar to me, its texture, its temperature. I have stood before him feeling very small and very young and very aware of the distance between what I was and what he needed me to become. That conversation was different from all of those, because he did not raise his voice. He sat down heavily in the chair by the window, and he looked out at the courtyard for a long time. When he finally spoke, he sounded less like a king than like a man who had been dreading a particular door for years and had finally heard the knock. He told me it would be handled. He told me this with the finality of a man who was not asking for my agreement. He told me that the succession of the kingdom required me to be above scandal, and above weakness, and above the particular foolishness he had watched developing in my chambers for years. Yes, years, he said, and I felt the floor shift slightly, and that the matter would be resolved quietly, and I would not speak of it again. I asked him what handled meant. He did not answer me directly. He stood and he looked at me with an expression that I had not seen on my father's face before, something that was adjacent to sorrow but was filtered through so many layers of authority and necessity that it had come out the other side as stone. And he walked out of my chambers. Within the hour, I heard it through the palace, the way all terrible things travel, quickly and in pieces. Omar had been taken. He was in the lower dungeon. He was being held pending the king's determination of appropriate punishment under royal law. I spent the first night standing at the window. I did not eat. This was not a decision. My body simply refused. The tray was brought, and the smell of the food reached me, and something inside me turned away from it with a completeness I had no controls over. It was as though some part of me that had been calibrated to him, to his presence, to the knowledge of his hands in the preparation of my food, to the specific ritual of care that surrounded every meal he brought me, simply could not process the information of food that came from elsewhere. My body understood what my mind was still trying to argue itself out of, that he was gone, and that nothing that was not connected to him could reach me.
The second night was the same. The third day, my personal physician was summoned. He stood at my bedside with a very serious face and told me that I needed to eat. I told him I was not hungry. He told me that hunger was not the relevant criterion. I thanked him for his service and turned back to the window. By the end of the first week, I was in bed. Not through any dramatic collapse, I simply ran out of the energy required to stand at windows. I lay on my side and looked at the chamber as though I were a guest in it, as though everything in it belonged to a version of my life that had already ended. The wardrobe was wrong. The dressing table was wrong. The particular alignment of objects that his hands had arranged and maintained every day for 4 years was being slowly undone by a replacement steward who was competent and professional and completely, entirely wrong. I was 30 pounds lighter and significantly emptier than a prince was supposed to be when my physician went to the king. What the physician said I do not know precisely, but I know the king came to my chambers 3 days later and stood in the doorway and looked at me in my bed with an expression that shook me slightly out of my fog, because I had never seen my father look frightened before. He was a king. Fear was not something he performed in front of witnesses. He was afraid. He looked at me, and he was afraid, and in the depths of where I had retreated, some part of me registered this as significant. But the larger part of me was still somewhere else, in the particular country of a person who was being kept from the thing their whole body is oriented around, and I could not fully make sense of him yet. He came in and he sat in the chair by the bed, and he looked at me for a long time. He said, "You are starving yourself." I said, "I am not hungry." He said, "The physician tells me you have not eaten a full meal in 11 days. I said nothing. He said, "This is not grief. This is—" And then he stopped, and I saw him searching for a word that was not weakness and not foolishness, and not any of the words in his usual vocabulary for things he did not understand, and failing to find one. I looked at him. I said, "He prepared my food every day for 4 years. He knew how I took my tea. He knew which foods gave me headaches. He knew when to add the ginger and when to leave it out. He remembered everything, Father. Every small thing for 4 years, and he never asked me to acknowledge it, and he never used it to ask for anything, and he never—" I had to stop. I pressed my hand over my mouth for a moment. I said, "My body cannot tell the difference between the loss of him and the loss of something it needs to survive. I am not choosing this. It is simply what is true." My father sat with that for a very long time. He left without telling me what was going to happen. The court was called to session 11 days later, a formal session, full court, full regalia, all the machinery of royal governance assembled and solemn and waiting. My father had summoned me back to health by implication. A royal session required a prince. A prince required enough strength to stand. I ate enough to stand. I had made my calculation. I walked into the throne room knowing what I was going to do. I had lain in my bed for 11 days and done nothing but think about it, and I had arrived at the understanding, with the clarity that sometimes comes from stripping everything down to its most essential parts, that I was not afraid. I had been afraid of this moment for years. I had rehearsed it and dreaded it, and let the fear of it keep me careful and silent and small. And now the thing I had feared had already happened. He was in the dungeon, and I was here, and the cost of silence had already been paid in full, and the fear had nothing left to attach itself to. I walked in. I took my place to the right of the throne. The court assembled. The ritual of the formal session proceeded through its opening cadences. The king sat on the throne and looked out over his court, and I stood beside him and waited. And then I stepped forward. I remember the sound of it, the shift, the rustle, the particular quality of silence that descends over a court when something unexpected enters the choreography. My father's eyes moved to me. I met them. I said, "Your Majesty, I ask the court's indulgence for a brief but significant address." My father's face was unreadable. He was very good at that. He said with the level authority of a man who knows he is about to hear something he cannot unhear, "Proceed." I turned to face the court. They were all there. The high council, the noble families, the generals, the courtiers who had watched me grow up, who had attended every formal occasion of my life, who had measured me against my father and found me various degrees of adequate. I saw all of them, and I felt, for the first time in 11 days, entirely present, entirely inside my own body, as though purpose had called me back from wherever I had been. I said, "For as long as there has been a kingdom, there has been a law that governs the heart, a law that determines which loves are legal and which are criminal, a law that names certain devotions as weaknesses and punishes them accordingly. I have spent 4 years living in careful obedience to that law, and I have spent 11 days lying in my bed understanding, with a precision that no argument can disturb, that I am not capable of continuing to do so." The silence in the room was absolute. I said, "I am the only heir to this kingdom. I understand what I represent. I understand the weight and the function of that representation, and I do not minimize it. But a crown worn by a man who has emptied himself of the only thing that makes him comprehensible to himself is not a crown. It is a performance, and I will not perform the life this throne requires if performing it means condemning a man who has done nothing in his life but love me,
carefully and quietly and at great personal cost, to a dungeon or worse. I reached up and removed the royal signet ring from my right hand. I held it in my palm for a moment. It was heavy. It had been heavy all my life, but I had never felt the weight of it as clearly as I did in that moment. All that it meant, all that removing it would cost me, all that it would free. I said, I renounce my claim to the succession. I set down the title, the inheritance, and all rights and privileges thereof. I stand before this court not as a prince, but as a man, and as a man I ask one thing: permission to go to the dungeon and be with the person I intend to spend the remainder of my life beside. I will not eat, I will not sleep in a bed, I will not accept any form of royal comfort or consideration. I will go down there, and I will sit beside him, and if that is where I die, then it is a better death than the one I would die living as your prince without him. I set the signet ring on the floor. The sound of it hitting the stone was very small, a coin sound, a nothing sound, and yet I felt the entire room receive it like a strike of lightning. I raised my head and looked at my father.
He had gone very still, and the thing I saw on his face was not the thing I had braced for, not the rage, not the disgust, not the calculated anger of a king who has been publicly defied. What I saw was something rawer and harder to look at, something behind the king, the man. I said, quietly enough that perhaps only he could hear me at that distance, though the throne room is deceptively acoustic, and I suspect everyone heard. I love you, Father. I have always loved you. But I cannot choose a kingdom over a person. I cannot choose a throne over the man who has spent 4 years being quietly broken for the crime of caring for your son. I'm going to him now. I turned to the guards at the far door. They looked at the king. They always looked at the king. I took a step toward the dungeon door. I took 3 steps. I know exactly how many because I counted them afterward in the quiet of reconstructed memory. 3 steps toward the door that led to the lower levels, toward the stone and the cold and the man sitting in it, whom I had not been able to reach for 11 days. 3 steps before my father's voice came across the throne room. Stop. It was not loud. My father has rarely needed volume. What he had instead was a quality of weight in his voice, a density that made even a single syllable arrive with the force of a command that had never, in the entire history of his reign, been ignored. I stopped. I turned. He had not stood from the throne. He sat as he always sat, straight, present, monumental. But something in the composition of him had changed in the time between my speech and this moment, and I could see it even across the full length of the throne room. Something had moved in him. Something had been displaced or rearranged. He said, still in that quiet voice that the room held its breath to hear, "If you walk through that door, you will die in a dungeon, and I will have killed you." I said, "Then that is what will have happened." He was silent for what felt like a very long time. The court around us was not breathing. I could feel the collective suspension of 100 people who understood that something was being decided in this room that exceeded the scope of ordinary court proceedings. Something was being decided about the nature of governance and love and what a kingdom was actually for. My father looked down at the signet ring on the floor. He had placed that ring on my hand himself. I was 8 years old. I remember the ceremony of it, the formal words, the court assembled and watching, my father's large and certain hands folding my smaller ones around the significance of that medal. I had worn it for 10 years. I had looked at it every day of my life as a prince. He rose from the throne. This was notable. A king does not rise for small things. A king's rising is itself a statement. He descended the 2 steps from the throne dais, and he crossed the room, not toward me, not toward the far door, but to where the ring lay on the stone floor. He bent, with the effort of a man who carried the weight of decades, and he picked it up. He stood holding it. He turned it over in his hands. He said to the court, to no one, to the room itself, "I have built a kingdom on the principle that continuation requires sacrifice, that the individual must bend to the institution, that the price of a throne is the surrender of certain things that lesser men might call essential." He paused. "I have believed this for 50 years. I have governed by it. I have raised my son by it." He looked at me.
He said, "And my son is standing in front of me, prepared to die rather than live without the person he loves, and I cannot." His voice did something I had never heard it do. Not quite a break, a compression, the way a strong material shows stress. He said more quietly, "I cannot watch my only son empty himself into a dungeon because I was too certain of my certainties to allow him one thing, one real thing." The room was extraordinarily still. He said, "Guards, release the steward." I felt my knees do something complicated. He looked at me and his expression was not warm. Warmth was not something my father had ever worn easily. And grief and love and the recognition of one's own mistakes do not arrive in his face as softness, but as a kind of stripped severity. The face of a man who has removed all of his defenses at once and is standing in the cold of it. And he said, "A kingdom without an heir is no kingdom, and an heir without the will to live is no heir. I have run out of arguments against the evidence before me." He turned to the court. He said, "You will receive an official declaration in due course. The law governing matters of this nature is under immediate review. What exists between my son and his steward is recognized by this court as a private matter of the crown. You will conduct yourselves accordingly." There was a silence. Then a slow, extraordinary thing happened in the court. It began at the edges. I saw it first in the faces of some of the younger nobles, the ones who had not yet been in this world long enough to have their softness fully bureaucratized, and it moved inward. An acknowledgement, a settling, the look of people who have witnessed something that will be in the histories they tell later. My father crossed to where I stood. He stopped in front of me. He was still holding the signet ring. He held it out. I looked at it, then I looked at him. He said very quietly, in a register that was meant only for me, "I am sorry for what was done to him. I did not—" He stopped, started again. "I was afraid of losing you to something I could not control. I expressed that fear in the wrong direction, and someone paid for it who did not deserve to. That is a wrong I will spend the remainder of my reign attempting to correct." I took the ring from him. I held it, and then I put it in my pocket. Not on my finger, not yet. I needed to go somewhere first before I was anyone's prince. I went to the dungeon door, and this time no one stopped me. He was sitting against the far wall when I found him. Not collapsed, not theatrical. Omar has never been theatrical about his suffering, which is one of the things about him that I love most deeply and find most difficult to bear. He was sitting with the precision of a person who is conserving themselves, back against the stone, hands folded, head slightly bowed. When the door opened and the torchlight found him, he looked up. I had prepared in some part of my mind something to say, some words that were equal to 11 days and everything that had preceded them, and the length of the corridor I had just walked, and the ring in my pocket, and the court above us, and every morning of 4 years. I did not say any of it. I crossed the room, and I sat down on the floor beside him, and I gathered him into my arms, and he pressed his face into my shoulder, and neither of us spoke for a very long time. There are moments that are too large for words and have to be held instead. He said eventually into the fabric of my shoulder, "You renounced the throne." I said, "I did." He pulled back and looked at me. His eyes in the torchlight were very serious. "Eric! Omar, you cannot simply—" "I can. I did. My father has since complicated matters. You will have to adjust to the fact that I am still, technically, the prince." He stared at me. "He stopped you." "He did."
He... Something moved through his expression. He looked away, looked back, said with careful precision, as though testing whether the words were real, "He accepted us?" I said, "He accepted the alternative less." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I was flogged. Twice." I know. My throat closed. I took his face in my hands, the way he had taken mine that evening in my chambers, the gesture that had started everything that led to this floor. I said, "I know, and I will spend a very long time not being at peace with that. But you are here. I am here. Whatever comes next, we face it from the same position." He leaned his forehead against mine. He said, "I told myself every morning when I came back to your chambers that one more day was worth it. That one more morning of making your coffee and laying out your coat and knowing you were safe and well, one more day of that was worth whatever it cost." I said, "It was not supposed to cost you that." He said, "I know, but I would have paid it 10 times over." We sat in the dungeon for another hour, not because we needed to, but because neither of us was ready to move yet. Because the floor was cold and the torchlight was uncertain, and we had both been starved of the other for 11 days. And there was a particular fullness of simply being in the same space that needed to be honored before we resumed being a prince and a steward and all the complicated, formal, public machinery of what came next. What came next was, in many respects, a negotiation. My father issued his declaration. The law, as he had promised, was placed under formal review. It would take time. Change in a kingdom of this age always takes more time than the heart would prefer, but the direction was set. And a king's direction, once declared before the full court, has a permanence that private decisions do not. Omar's status was changed. Not immediately, not simply. Some courtiers objected. Counselors who couched their objections in language about precedent and tradition and the order of things, who said, "This is not how it is done," with the particular urgency of people who need how it is done to remain fixed because their own position depends on the fixedness. My father heard all of them with the patience of a man who has already made up his mind and is merely allowing the objections their ceremonial due. Omar was appointed to a formal position within the household with a title that was finally commensurate with the reality of what he was, the person who ran the prince's establishment, who managed the chambers and the staff and the schedules and the 1,000 details of a royal household with an efficiency that the court had benefited from for years without ever properly acknowledging. He moved, officially, into the suite of rooms that adjoined mine. The adjoining door, which had always been there, remained unlocked. We shared chambers from the first night, without apology and without announcement. The palace adapted, as palaces do, as populations do, as any group of people adapts when the most powerful person in the room makes something plainly, inarguably true. They adjusted. I will not pretend that it was perfectly smooth. There were mornings when I would walk through the official wing and feel the particular quality of certain gazes, the ones that were not hostile but were watchful, calibrating, waiting to see how this new arrangement settled. There were members of the court whose comfort with us was more formal than genuine and who would need more time. I understood this. I did not have unlimited patience for it, but I understood it. What I did not understand and refused to adjust to was any situation that required us to be apart. This is the thing that the court eventually understood about us, and I believe it is the thing that more than anything else defined the particular shape of our life together in those first years after the dungeon. We were constitutionally, catastrophically incapable of separation. Not in the frantic, anxious way of people who are afraid, not from insecurity or possessiveness or any failure of individual selfhood, but from the specific experience of people who have felt the cost of distance in their bodies, in 11 days without food, in years of silent aching, in stone floors and cold corridors, and the particular torture of being in the same palace as the person you love and being unable to reach them, and have decided, with full and conscious intention, never to court that cost again. If I were in a meeting, he was in it. Not always as a participant, he was not a counselor and had no formal seat at the strategy table, but in the room, working at the side table, organizing correspondence, available, present, within the same walls. If he was overseeing the household affairs, I was nearby, doing my own work, reading dispatches, handling correspondence, perfectly capable of operating independently, but in the same room, with one ear always lightly attuned to the presence of him, the way you stay aware of a sound that has become necessary to the sense of a space. We did everything together that could be done together and postponed the things that could not be done together until a time when they could. The court found this amusing, I think, and touching, and occasionally impractical. The senior advisor to the throne, a man of considerable years and professional patience, came to me once in the second year of our new arrangement and said, with the particular diplomatic delicacy of a man who is trying to navigate an unusual situation, that some of the official meetings might benefit from a more, and he searched carefully for the word, conventional configuration. I told him with great politeness that I was happy to discuss conventionality at length and that Omar would be present for that conversation, as he was for all conversations. The advisor accepted this with equanimity that I genuinely respected. Omar himself was the first to acknowledge and occasionally gently tease the particular clinginess of our new configuration. There was a morning, one of those mornings full of sunlight and the smell of the gardens coming in through the open window, when I had followed him, without quite meaning to, through 3 consecutive rooms while he dealt with household matters, and he had turned at the doorway of the 4th room and looked at me with that modest, barely permitted smile and said, "Did you need something, Your Highness?" I said, with complete dignity, I was going in this direction anyway. He said, "Were you?" I said, "The windows in this corridor are particularly good." He looked at me for a moment. Then he held the door open and waited for me to come through. And when I passed him, he briefly pressed his hand against my back, a gentle pressure, a hello, a reminder, and said nothing else about it. We were not the same people we had been before everything broke and reassembled itself. Neither of us would pretend otherwise. There were nights when he would go still and distant in a way that I had learned to recognize, and I knew he was somewhere in a memory that I could not follow him into, some cold stone corridor or flogging block or moment of isolated fear, and I would not try to pull him out of it but would simply stay, be present, be warm and available, and there when the distance receded, the way you leave a light on for someone making their way through the dark. There were mornings when I would wake from a dream of the dungeon and reach across the bed, and the relief of finding him there, solid and warm and breathing beside me, would wash over me with a force that was almost grief. A relief so large it had grief in it, the way very sweet things sometimes contain something close to pain. We had been shaped by what had nearly unmade us. We wore the shape of it, and we did not try to pretend otherwise, and we did not apologize for it. When people in the court said we were too clingy, too inseparable, too consistently, publicly, cheerfully unwilling to be in different rooms for any longer than necessity required, we accepted the description without amendment. Yes, correct, we were. The alternative had been a dungeon and an empty bed, and 11 days of my body refusing to process the fact of food. Given the alternative, we would take clingy. My father watched all of this from the remoteness of the throne, with an expression that was unreadable, as his expressions had always been, but which contained, I believed then and believe still, something that was not quite approval and not quite tenderness, but was perhaps the closest he had ever come to both at once. He had chosen us. He had stood up in front of his court and chosen his son's life over his kingdom's convention, and whatever the cost of that would prove to be across the years of his reign, he bore it without complaint, and I loved him for it in a way I had never quite loved him before, not with the complicated conditional love of a son trying to meet an unachievable standard, but with something simpler and more whole. He had been afraid, and he had been wrong, and when confronted with the evidence of both, he had chosen differently.
For a king, for a man of his formation, that was an extraordinary thing. Omar went to see him once, alone, in the first months. I do not know exactly what was said. Omar kept the content of that meeting private, which I respected, and only told me when he returned that it had been necessary and was now complete. But the quality of the space between Omar and my father changed after that. The specific tension, the tension of two people who share a secret they cannot name, eased. They were not warm. They would never be precisely warm, but they were, from that meeting forward, honest with each other in the particular way that two people can be honest when both of them understand what the cost of dishonesty has already been. I know what it is to want something so much that your body treats its absence as an injury. I know what it is to hold a grief so large that it defeats hunger. I know what it is to stand in a throne room with a ring in your palm and feel, for the first time in your life, that you are not performing anything, that you are simply standing in the truth of yourself and offering it to whoever wishes to take it. I know what it is to be loved by someone who kept coming back to you, morning after morning, through everything the world put between you. I know what that costs. I know it is not ordinary. I know there is nothing more extraordinary in any kingdom, in any century, than a love that chooses itself again and again in the face of every reason not to. Omar is asleep in the chair beside my desk as I speak these words to you. He fell asleep over a logistics report, which he would find professionally mortifying if I told him, and I will not tell him, and I will let him sleep. The window is open. The evening is coming in from the garden with that particular golden quality that the late hours have in this season, and it is touching his face, and I am watching it, and I am, with everything I have, with every part of what I am, at peace. I was a prince who fell in love with his steward. I fell harder than anyone should fall for something they cannot have, and I held it in silence for longer than silence should be required, and I nearly lost him to the gap between what the law allows and what the heart cannot prevent. But I stood in a room, and I set down a ring, and I said, "This is what I am. This is what I will not surrender." And my father, my king, my impossible, complicated father, stood up from his throne and said, "Stop." Not stop loving him, stop walking toward the dungeon, stop choosing death over life, stop making me watch my only son disappear because I was too rigid to reconfigure my understanding of what a kingdom is for. A kingdom, it turns out, is for the people in it, even the people the laws forgot to protect, even the steward, even the prince, even us. The ring is back on my hand. Omar's logistics report is sliding off his lap as he sleeps. The evening is gold and wide and unhurried, and I am going to wake him gently in a moment and tell him to come to bed, and he is going to protest that he was not sleeping, that he was resting his eyes, and I am going to say yes, of course, and hold out my hand, and he is going to take it. He always takes it. He has always taken it. Every morning for 4 years, and through everything after, and for every morning yet to come, he takes my hand and I take his, and between us we hold something that was not supposed to survive, that the law was not designed to protect, that my father was not raised to accept. It survived anyway. We survived anyway. That is the whole of the story. That is all of it, distilled to its essential truth, that we survived, and that the love is intact, and that the man I would have died in a dungeon beside is asleep in the chair next to my desk, and the window is open, and the evening is gold, and I am the luckiest, unlucky person in the history of this kingdom, and I would not trade a single day of it, not even the worst ones, because every one of them led here, where he is, here where we both are, together. The end.